but through simulations using machine learning models. So we're going to focus on syntactic generalization, and what do I mean by that? I'll just start with some motivation from linguistics. So in a certain kind of linguistics, especially generative linguistics, people are very interested in understanding when sentences are judged to be bad sentences of a language. So those are usually marked with little stars in the cut here to the left of the sentence. So we have a judgment, which means that you read the sentence and then you either say, well, the sentence sounds fine to me as a sentence of English, or you would say the sentence doesn't sound so good. And people have, the interesting thing is that people have judgments about very obscure sentences that they're almost certainly never have heard before. And not only have they not heard the specific sentence, they often probably have not heard sentences that are like this one, in that you wouldn't be able to just like switch out one of the words for another word and find it in a corpus. Like this kind of sentence is very rare in a corpus, and it's likely that people have never heard it. So I'm going to walk you through this specific example. This is called the parasitic gaps in syntax. So what happens here is you can ask a question about sentence 1A. What book did you review without reading? Right? And then the answer is, I don't know, that book. I reviewed that book without reading it. But if it's not the same thing that you're both reviewing and reading, then you can no longer ask that question. So you can say from sentence 2A, I reviewed the proposal without reading the book. That's fine. But you can't ask that question. What book did you review the proposal without reading? And the answer could be, well, this is the book that I reviewed the proposal without reading this book. But people tend to think that this sentence is ungrammatical. I don't know if you agree with this judgment, but I think it's a pretty robust one. So there's a bit of a mystery here. That's the kind of stuff that syntacticians are really interested in. The judgments about sentences that are very likely to be far from the from our day-to-day experience, and yet we have intuitions about those sentences. So it has to be that the way that we have intuition about those sentences is by generalizing from other sentences that we've heard in some way. And what Chomsky says that the way that you generalize from those sentences is using universal grammar-like principles that tell you how the grammar of the language works based on a very small number of examples. And the fact that you learn the grammar of English from a relatively small number of examples is sometimes referred to as the poverty of the stimulus argument. So the way it goes is there's no evidence in the corpus for the grammaticality or ungrammaticality of certain structures in the corpus that a child learns from. And yet, people eventually learn these obscure grammatical distinctions, even though there's no evidence, explicit evidence for those specific distinctions in the data set that they're learning from. So the conclusion that Chomsky reaches is that when we learn a language, we only consider a very small number of possible grammars, even though there are many grammars that could be consistent with the corpus that you're observing. We only consider a small subset of those. And universal grammar tells us what those possible grammars are. And according to this argument, that also explains why, for the most part, people generalize in the same way, even though they have somewhat different experience with language, and people have different cognitive abilities or whatever. But for the most part, there is a pretty consistent behavior that people show of generalization from a relatively small amount of examples. So this is from linguistics, the phenomenon that syntacticians are really interested in, describing, at least in a certain tradition of the linguistics, describing what people view as possible languages when they come to the problem of acquiring a language from positive evidence, from just hearing the way that other people speak. So where do neural networks come in? So we're going to use neural networks as just as a sort of infrastructure for studying whether the assumption that the poverty is poor, the assumption of the poverty of the stimulus is justified. And the way we're going to do it is conceptually very straightforward. So we have a computational learner, and we give it what Chomsky called the primary linguistic data, which is just utterances that we hear as children. And we give that to the learner, and we observe how the learner generalizes to more complex sentences, to sentences that are missing from the primary linguistic data. And we test if the way that the learner, the computational learner generalizes is similar to the way that humans generalize. Now, if our computational learner doesn't have anything that looks like universal grammar, it doesn't have constraints on the types of grammars that it can consider. In fact, it doesn't even explicitly consider any grammars. That's going to be the case for the learners that we will look at. Then we can conclude that we don't necessarily need universal grammar to explain human language acquisition in this specific respect, right? So if people generalize in a certain way, and we can get a computational system to generalize in the same way without putting all of those constraints on the system that Chomsky argued we need to put on humans, we can conclude from that that those constraints are not necessary for language acquisition. So it doesn't mean that humans don't have certain constraints on how they learn language, but it's just that the argument from the poverty of the stimulus is not doesn't hold, because it's not necessary for people to have those constraints. Now, if we find a learner that generalizes in a similar way to humans, then we can try to play with it and see what aspects of that learner are responsible for the human-like generalization behavior. So maybe we can train it on different kinds of data, or we can give it a different order of acquisition. We can start with simple sentences and move to more complex ones, and see how all of those variations on the training corpus affect the outcome of learning. And that can teach us something about what makes certain linguistic phenomena easier or harder to acquire in different circumstances. But what we're going to start with is the first bullet point. We're going to take a classic phenomenon that has been argued to demonstrate the poverty of the stimulus argument, and try to teach it to neural networks that do not have these innate constraints that Chomsky argued people need to have to learn this phenomenon. Okay, it's like an overview of a certain kind of research program. I think this is maybe a good time to stop for questions if people have any. You can also just raise your hand later if you have a question. So it's I have until 5, right? That's the yeah. Okay. So here's a phenomenon that in the 70s when Chomsky introduced this. Sorry, I need to turn off my sound. I think that would be the right thing to do here. So, Linzen. Okay. I'll turn off my sound. Back to this. So the phenomenon that Chomsky started out with, it's a very simple one, and later people have complained that this, like Colin Phillips and others have complained that the focus on the specific phenomenon is unjustified, and actually there are other phenomena that where there's a much worse poverty of the stimulus issue, but we'll start with that one. And that phenomenon is polar or yes/no question formation. So, sorry for these kind of dumb sentences. In English, in general, we form a question by moving the auxiliary of the main verb to the beginning of the sentence. So here we actually explicitly included the auxiliary. You can also say it, the zebra chuckle, but it's easier to understand it when you see the auxiliary explicitly. And what Chomsky said is that there are two rules that are consistent with this input-output here. And so the first rule is the correct rule. That's the actual rule that derives questions in English. And we can call it move main. So what we do here is we parse the sentence. We find the auxiliary that is attached to the main verb, and then we move that to the beginning of the sentence. Right? That's what you're supposed to do to form a question in English. But if all of the sentences that you see, all the input-output pairs are similar to this pair, then there are other rules that also apply here that would derive the output from the input. So one example is move first, which means just look at the sentence, at the words of the sentence from left to right, find the first word from the left that is an auxiliary, and then move that word to the beginning of the sentence. So the output here would be the same thing. Does the zebra chuckle? So why does it matter if you have the same rule, if you have two different rules that give us the same outcome? Well, the reason it matters is that this rule generalizes correctly to more complex sentences, and that rule doesn't. Right? So it's about generalization again. That's the crucial thing that we care about. So an example where move main will generalize correctly and move first won't is the case where you have a relative clause modifying the subject. So here the first auxiliary in orange is, well, as not the main auxiliary, which is in pink. So here we have a dissociation between the first and main auxiliary, which means that the two rules will make different predictions. So move main, which is the correct rule, will give us the output. Can my walrus that will eat giggle? That's the right output. It's grammatical. But if we apply move first, we'll get will my walrus that eat can giggle, so which is very aggressively ungrammatical. So what Chomsky argued is that these sentences where there is a dissociation between the first and the main auxiliary are very rare, which is true. I mean, if you look at a corpus, you'll find a question on a sentence like this one, maybe once every something like every 100,000 sentences, maybe you'll have one of those questions. That's the order of magnitude. Could be even less than that. So the argument here is that, well, Chomsky obviously didn't do a corpus study. Those corpus studies were done much later than that. And then there was a debate about like whether we think that those very small number of examples are enough for children to learn to reject the move first rule. So Chomsky's argument was much more armchair than that. He just said, well, you will never see example of a question based on the sentence in a child-directed speech corpus. So let's adopt that hypothesis that those sentences don't actually exist. Those questions don't actually exist. And I think you can make the case that because those sentences are quite rare, it's possible for some children to never have seen them by the age of 3 or 4 when they form correct questions. So the argument is, again, children are not exposed to these disambiguating cases, and yet they learn the move main rule. And the way that Chomsky interprets that is the children are equipped with, as part of universal grammar, they're equipped with this constraint that tells them that you should only consider grammar rules that are stated over the parse tree. So a rule can never make reference to just the linear order of the words in the sentence. You can't say scan the sentence from left to right and find the first word that does something or other. It's always about the parse of the sentence. So here it would be find the main verb, find. Am I doing something wrong? What?
I think I muted somebody.
Okay, good. Yeah. So how are we gonna test this with our neural network? We're going to start by constructing a very simple synthetic case example, and then we'll look at actual child-directed speech in a little bit. So remember, questions are just like, we can construct a data set where all of the training sentences have this ambiguity in terms of which rule derives the output. So here I'm marking it as like this alternating color between orange and pink. So the input was always a statement, and the output was always with either a question about that statement or the statement itself. So that seems like a really easy task to just copy the input. The reason we included this task of just copying the input into the output was that we wanted to show the learner that relative clauses on the subject are grammatical. We just didn't want to tell the learner how to form questions based on those sentences. So we did include declarative sentences with the relative clause on the subject. We just never included the corresponding question. And we constructed a lot of sentences like this one from this kind of fragment of English. All of the sentences are English sentences, but there are many sentences of English that are not in this grammar. And we trained a bunch of different neural networks to see how they generalize from this information to forming questions on these sentences that have a relative clause on the subject. So we're going to evaluate the success of the network in terms of its generalization to new sentences with 2 metrics, one that's easier and one that's a little bit harder. One is whether the full output that the learner is producing is consistent with the rule. So in this case, you have to get all of the output words right to be considered consistent with the rule. And then we also have a simpler, more lenient evaluation metric, which is just about the first word that the system is producing for the question. And the reason for that is that sometimes the systems, because they're very simple, they'll make mistakes that are irrelevant to what we care about. So instead of giggle, they'll produce a similar word like smile or something. So we don't really care about that from the perspective of syntactic generalization. So we're going to have this more lenient evaluation metric that only considers the first word. So in our first experiment, as I said, we train on this simplified data, and we test it on that simplified data. And then we will move to more complex settings. So just briefly, I'm not going to go into all the detail of the early experiments because they're early, and I've talked about them too many times. We tried a bunch of different neural network architectures of the kind that were popular 6-7 years ago. And so those were RNN encoder-decoder models, where you give the declarative sentence as the input to the encoder, and then the decoder produces the question at the end. And here in this experiment, we tried a bunch of different RNN variants and different kinds of attention, either with attention or without. And then at the time, people were looking at different ways to implement attention. So we just tried a lot of combinations of hyperparameters like that to see if we can get generalization that looked like the human generalization pattern. Now, the result was that in the test set, so the test set included sentences that have the same structure as the training sentences. So crucially, they did not include questions with a relative clause on the subject. And here, most of the architectures did very well, so which shows that we were able to learn to perform this task in distribution. But when we looked at out of distribution generalization to questions that the model did not get examples of in training, we found this very wide variability across the different architectures. And at least one of the architectures, which is like a GRU with a kind of RNN with this like location-based attention, which is a kind of attention, the details don't really matter here. Actually led the models to adopt the move main rule, which we thought was really cool. However, when we looked at the more specific pattern of errors, we found that even those models made errors that are quite different from the errors that children make. So I'll show you. Okay, actually, I will skip that. I won't show you the specific differences between the errors that the models made and the errors that the children made, because I really want to talk about the more recent stuff. So overall, the results of these experiments were relatively negative. We didn't find that any of the models. I'm happy to share the slides afterwards, but by the way, so you don't need to like take photos. So you're welcome to take photos if you'd like to. Just saying.
What's your notation between the second column and the last column? I couldn't really understand it.
These two?
No, there are two different notations.
Notations?
What do you mean? What's the difference between the second column and the last column?
So the first column is without attention, and so I guess in the classic encoder-decoder model, the only way that the encoder can affect what the decoder does is through that last hidden state of the encoder, E sub 6 here. And the idea of and that causes a lot of strain on that specific bottleneck. Now, if you the idea of attention is to relax that assumption that all of the information has to flow through the last hidden state. Each of the coding steps is allowed to look at all of the hidden states of the encoder and determine what token to produce based on some linear combination of those states that and yeah, the coefficients of that linear combination are determined by another neural network. So basically that gives you a lot more flexibility, and in practice, all of the like sequence to sequence models employ attention stays. In fact, it turns out that attention is all you need. Now, the other thing is that at the time there were two different ways to do attention. So one was based on the index of the word, and one was based on the kind of dot product that comes as a similarity between the representation of the word in the encoder and the representation of what you're trying to produce next. And we tried both of those, and only one of them got the. Yeah. Anyway, does that help?
I was asking what's the difference between the second column and the last column?
Right.
So only the attention with attention without attention.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we were not very happy with any of those models. So one concluded that's a little bit more positive from that series of experiments was that the combination of these kind of low-level architectural features affected generalization patterns quite a bit, which was interesting and a little bit surprising, because none of these modifications of the basic RNN setup included universal grammar or any grammar rules, really. They were just like very low-level modifications at the kind of deep learning level and not at the linguistics level. So we were kind of interested in how dramatic the differences were between the architectures. But the important thing is that none of the combinations of these features led to consistent hierarchical generalization that was kind of human-like. The only way that we were able to get the models to produce human-like questions where the rule that creates the question is move main and not move first was to actually incorporate parses into the network. This is kind of what you see here on the right. We used the tree structured neural networks that have explicit parses of the input and the output in them. And that forces the network to produce questions that are consistent with the hierarchical generalization. But that's kind of cheating. I mean, not cheating, but it's not exactly what. That's basically implementing Chomsky's idea that the only way that you're allowed to form a question is by going through the parse, and you're not. This network can't even consider the possibility that a question is formed based on the linear order of the words. The only way that it could form a question is based on the parse. So we can think of it as an implementation of Chomsky's idea of the structure sensitivity of rules constraint. Yeah.
Do you mind saying a few more words about the training and the testing? Because you said that you didn't care if it says giggle or smile. So there is some semantic. What is it exposed to in training? Do you train it from scratch or is it pre-trained and then?
Yeah, here it was all trained from scratch. We're gonna have some pre-trained networking a bit.
And then it's tested only on the questions. It's not tested on other syntactic structures or human-like performance, just about whether.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's the advantage of Chomsky's tree structure? Obviously, tree structure is hierarchical, right? So what can be moved and where it can be moved? Sometimes something cannot be moved because of blocking node. Right.
Right. Yeah. In this case, we looked at very simple questions. There's very interesting work on island constraints and how easy it is to learn them from a corpus without encoding the constraints explicitly as in universal grammar or something. So we actually did a little bit of work on this in Norwegian, which I thought was nice, but that's based on work that Ethan Wilcox did for his dissertation at Harvard. But yeah, it turns out that you can learn a lot of island constraints without having explicit syntactic structure in the learner. Not all of them necessarily, and the results are kind of complex, but for the most part, it seems that you can do fine without subjacency or one of those principles that people talked about a lot in the 80s. Yeah, I'm happy to send references later. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to talk about is how we bring this kind of general idea into a more realistic setting. So, of course, when children learn a language, they learn a lot more than just a single syntactic transformation. So it's not like they're translating, their only goal in learning language is to translate declarative sentences into questions. So they learn many different syntactic transformations at the same time, and they learn a lot more than just transformations. So, for example, they learn things about meaning, of course, but they also try to learn to predict the next word. That is often helpful to facilitate language comprehension. And it turns out in practice, when you look at language models that are just trained to predict the next word, it turns out that they learn a lot about language. So the example that I just gave before, you teach a language model to predict the next word in a corpus of, I don't know, 100 million words. And that language model doesn't have grammar implemented in it when you design it. And yet it learns these pretty subtle constraints on which questions you can ask that are called island constraints. So there's a very big literature about this at this point, which there wasn't when we started the project that I just talked about before, but this is like a review that we did a few years ago. So, and as I mentioned, there are in fact, if you look at a corpus, there are in fact some disambiguating examples that tell you that move main or the structure-sensitive rules are more compatible with the data than the linear rules. So most of the experiments that we did since the beginning of this project that I showed before used word prediction models or pre-trained models as they came to be known. So we started by looking at one of those kind of standard word prediction models, pre-trained model that was released by a team from Google a few years ago. And we analyzed its syntactic generalization abilities, and we found that when you pre-train on this very large corpus, then the generalization actually ends up being structural, more like the human-like pattern. However, when we apply the similar methodology to learning from child-directed speech, we did not get the structural generalization pattern. So it looks like if you train on many, many sentences here, I forget exactly the number, but it was like literally billions of sentences. At some point, you learn to generalize in the correct way. But if you learn from the more impoverished data the children learn from, it looks like you don't necessarily with the language models that we use these days. So this tentatively supports actually the poverty of the stimulus argument from Chomsky. And then we did some analyses on which factors, both in terms of the architecture of the network and in terms of the training corpus, lead to more or less structural generalization. So I think I'm gonna mostly talk about number 2. I'll mention number 1 and maybe we can ask me about number 3. So first of all, as I mentioned, we looked at this corpus, at this model that's trained on an enormous corpus. Here's this to give you a sense of the scale here. This is on a log scale. So the model that we analyzed at T5 was trained on more than 100 billion words. And that compares to kind of average child growing up in the United States that is exposed to 20 to 50 million words. So it's like multiple orders of magnitude more than children. But we can still take one of these models that are trained on a very large corpus and teach them the task in the same way that we taught it to the models from this first part of the lecture, which were not pre-trained on word prediction. So we fine-tune them. We just continue to train them on examples where the questions are formed from sentences that are ambiguous with respect to which rule derives the question. And then we see how they generalize to these questions where there's a relative clause on the subject that disambiguates the two rules. It's the same paradigm, only it's applied to a pre-trained model. And the result that we got with this paradigm with this model were actually quite good. So here, what these we look not only at question formation but also at passivization, which is another syntactic transformation. So the full sequence accuracy, which means the proportion of the time that the model produced the exactly correct question as the output, was kind of hovered around 80% accuracy. But the first word accuracy, which is the most important one, was basically 100%. So it basically always started the question with the right auxiliary. So that is good, but it's a little bit satisfying from the perspective of the human language acquisition debate, because we're training the model on so many more data points than children get. And this is a really important thing about a very important limitation, I guess, of using like what's called large language models, or one of these standard systems that you can get from big companies to try to address cognitive questions, because the way that they're trained is so different from the way that children learn. So to make a little bit more progress towards making the setup more realistic, more human-like, we I can just well, I guess maybe we'll have questions, but I think I can just mute the whole thing here. What's that?
They're muting them.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, good. Thanks for muting. So what is child-directed speech? And many of you probably have seen this before, but it's just transcriptions of conversations between children and their caregivers. I mean, conversations can sometimes be like a bit of an exaggeration, but it's very simple sentences, very unlike the sentences that T5, the language model that we just looked at, are trained on, which would be sentences from law articles and Wikipedia, and very long and complex sentences. So this is the data that children actually learn from, and there's very little signal here about complex syntax, as you can see. So our paradigm is very simple. We train a language model on this corpus. By training a language model just means training to predict the next word. That's all it does. It's not given any syntactic supervision, and we're not telling it what we're planning to do with it once it's trained. And then at the end, we fine-tune it, which means that we just continue to train it on a small number of questions. And the way we give it the question, because it's not a sequence model anymore, it's just an autoregressive language model that predicts the next word, we concatenate the input and the output. So to successfully predict the fine-tuning data set, the language model needs to know that after the period, the first word should be the auxiliary does. So that's how the language modeling objective teaches it to form questions during the fine-tuning period. And the questions that we give the model in this fine-tuning phase are based on the questions that actually occur in childhoods. That's the important thing. So unlike what we did before, where we generated these tens of thousands of questions based on this synthetic grammar, here we take questions from childhoods. There's a parsed portion of childhoods, so we can look at the structural analysis of the question and then construct the corresponding declarative sentence from the question. And this is the example that we give the model to train on. So we're trying to be as realistic here as possible. So whereas before we took a very large model that was trained on hundreds of billions of words, or around 100 billion words, and fine-tuned it on many, many questions that we generated. Here we trained the language model on just child-directed speech, which is both a much smaller corpus, I think around 5 million words here, and much simpler language. And then we fine-tune it on questions that are real questions that occur in child-directed speech. So now the question is how to evaluate this model, and we have two ways of doing that. First of all, we start by evaluating the pre-trained model. So that's before fine-tuning on explicit declarative sentence question pairs. So we construct all possible versions of a question, and then we just score all of these, just compute the log probability of all of these sentences given the model. So this is not given the declarative, right? We only look at the probability of the questions here, because the model didn't learn to associate explicitly a declarative and question. This is something that happened only later at the fine-tuning stage. So which one here is the correct one? The dog who has seen a boy did try, whatever. So here the main verb is did, and has is the first verb. So what you're supposed to do here is move the main verb to the beginning and delete it from its original position. And you should keep the first verb in its original position. But there are other things that you might see a model do, and we've seen models make all of those other kinds of error where you move the right auxiliary to the beginning, but you forget to delete it. This is what happens here. You move the right auxiliary to the beginning, but then you delete the other one. So all of these are things that you can imagine the model doing. So what did it do? Well, here we actually tried two different models. One is LSTM based. It's more similar to the models that we tried at the beginning, and also a transformer. And here's the outcome. So this is the correct form of the question, which you would like the model to assign the highest probability to of all of these six. But it turned out that in most cases, the variant of the question that got the highest probability from these six options was this one, which was a really bad one. I mean, it is, you delete the main auxiliary completely, and then you just double the first auxiliary. So here we're not very impressed with what the model is able to learn from child-directed speech. Question here?
Yeah, I'm just curious because you say you use the term the model deletes or doesn't
Right.
delete, but the model predicts the next word.
Yes, yeah.
So
It's,
it doesn't really have any
Yeah.
like motivation to use the same words, right?
yeah, no, I mean, I'm yeah, fair enough. I'm speaking loosely here because we're not learning a transformation. It's just we're scoring sequences of words.
So the
so-
question is how the model makes the right prediction. I believe look at the correct one. Give the person who has seen this boy try. So in terms of syntax, we do have motivations. For example, you cannot move that has out of who clause. Where this is CP, right?
Mhm. Right.
Then you can move because it's blocked. I mean, block. The person that MP blocks the movement of that auxiliary out of who clause. Where the MP, the person that the MP blocks the movement. But for did, that's okay. Where did doesn't belong to that CP. So that's my motivation.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm trying to answer both of these questions at the same time, but they're very different from each other. So, yeah. Okay.
I mean, for some reason.
Yeah.
So that movement is blocked. For
well,
some structural reason.
I mean, the model seems happy to move. I mean, yeah, as Lita said, no movement is really happening here. Just a string of words, and we don't have a literal transformation that's happening with an input and output. But the model seems to like a question like this one. Okay, maybe I'm.
That's okay.
Like you, are you describing the grammar, the grammar of English, or something that the model is doing? I guess that's the question. I think you're right that the grammar of English doesn't allow us to move the auxiliary out of the.
I'm talking about the distance of movement.
Right. Yeah. Right. So I guess there's I think you're explaining right. That's a good point. So I guess what do you mean is that you need to we as syntacticians we want to explain not just why movement happens according to the tree, but also if there are other places in the tree that you could move out of. Like why can you not move from those? Yeah. But I think that's like a little bit different from what
It's not about a model. Your model.
Yeah.
It's about the syntax.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Well, so I mean, given the limitations that Libby pointed out, that this is something a little bit unsatisfying just looking at the probabilities that the pre-trained model gives us. So we can look at the fine-tuned model that is actually trained specifically to perform the transformation from the declarative to the question, and see how often the first word that the model produces after the period is the correct auxiliary. So the answer is not very often. So what we're seeing here is that when the question is on a sentence like this that has a relative clause on the subject, the models often, actually more often, produce or prefer the first auxiliary over the main auxiliary. So these bars, the difference between them is not so important. These bars are the questions that are consistent with move main, and these bars are the questions that are consistent with move first. And what we want the model to do is this, but always prefer the questions that are hierarchical. And in fact, it seems to have a preference for the wrong question. So the probability of the correct auxiliary after the period is lower than the probability of the incorrect one. So that's how we have been extending this idea to more natural settings. Of course, you can go a lot more natural than this, and we would like to, but this is what we have so far. So yeah, this is what I was going to talk about today. As I said, you don't actually have time to go into the last thing. So overall, I'm actually, we don't need to do like a summary. That's fine. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to thank my collaborators, and maybe we can do some like discussion in the last 80 seconds of this talk.
Thank you, but I think we can go a little bit beyond if you
Yeah.
we had a certain.
No. It's fine. We can. I think it's better to take questions if people want to stay for a few more minutes.
Question.
There's a question in the chat.
Yeah,
So Fran says, you mentioned learning the syntactic pattern through this model. Is the syntactic pattern sufficient enough to ignore things like tonal raising? That is, how much of question formation is down to other than syntactic structures, and how much is down to other factors of linguistics, such as phonetics? This also explains why children do not gain structural generalization.
children do.
Yeah. Well, so I think maybe I'm not sure that I hope that I'm not like misrepresenting the question, but when we talked about making the setup more natural, more similar to what children see as learning from speech as opposed to from text is a really important step. And there's definitely arguments that prosody, for example, teaches you certain things about syntax that just looking at text doesn't. So we might be in this experiment that the last episode I talked about, this one, we might be underestimating the amount of syntactic information that's available in child-directed speech because we're only looking at the transcriptions and not the recordings. So ideally, what we would do is look at the recordings. Unfortunately, the issue there is the state. Then you have to also solve the speech recognition task, and that's not an easy thing to do. So on the balance, it might end up being harder. But the information could be there in the prosody. That's missing from text. We could also imagine, though I don't have any evidence for that, and I'm a little skeptical that it actually works. But that's something that comes up a lot. That when children learn language, they learn it in a grounded setting. Of course, it's not. They don't just hear sentences. They hear sentences that describe the visual scene or that have something to do with the environment that they're in, or with an action that they do or don't do. So that's information that is available to children and is not available to our models. So that's also unfair. We're being unfair to the models in a certain way. So it's not easy to find exactly the right setup. Of course, the ideal setup would be to have a model that learns from video recordings of interaction between children and adults, and exactly the number of hours of such interactions that children have. I don't actually know how many those would be, like 5,000 hours, let's say. But then you also want your model to be able to interact with the environment, to like actively perform experiments and see what people say in response to that. So it's not easy to match the learning setting exactly. That's the goal eventually. There's a nice paper from my colleagues at NYU that came out this last week. They actually looked at recordings from head-mounted cameras that they put on like little babies' heads. I mean, not they, other people put those cameras in the babies' heads, and then you can see exactly what the baby is looking at. And there are also recordings of what people were saying while the baby was looking at whatever it is, the truck, or I don't know. And they show that you can learn the meaning of words pretty well from that data. It's like not exactly controversial, maybe, that you can learn word meaning from this data, but that's the kind of data that would be really nice to try to test these hypotheses on.
A few words about your data. It seems obvious your neural network models and word prediction models. So both rely heavily on so-called primary language data, which are inductive in nature, right? So your models are amazing. They may overcome or avoid the interference from so-called linear inductive biases, right? So I'm thinking about so-called linear inductive biases. Linear order, it means surface configuration of language. So all the data only reflect surface configurations. In syntax, okay, we also think about deep structure, not only surface structure. Okay, in order to generalize grammatical patterns.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you need tons of data.
Right.
Through such observation, then you come up with the grammatical patterns. But the other way around, if Chomsky used the term transformational grammar in 1950s, in 1960s, then he didn't think that's right. Then he revised the model to transformational generative grammar. Now he got rid of transformation, only generative. So I ask myself a question: how grammatical patterns or configurations are generated by a very finite set of rules, which generate an infinite number of sentences? I'm thinking about that issue. Your models are amazing. They can do some things differently from humans.
Yeah.
Just my comment. Well, it's a trained transformers.
Yeah, it's interesting that they're called, I guess, transformers. They were created for input-output tasks like machine translation. So that's why they're called that, maybe? Actually, I don't know.
Yeah, the original paper was
It's a dumb name.
for Google Translate.
Yeah, but like, is that what they call them, transformers? I don't know. Yeah, but it's similar to transformations. Yeah, Libby had
Yeah, I have a question that's between this slide and the slide that had all the 6 options of what the model likes. And can you go back for a second? Because when this one, yeah.
This?
There are options here that I like better than the correct. So the person who seen this boy did try. So I'm just wondering, so the question has 2 points, sorry.
Wait,
It's a memory test.
Like?
Here, the question is coming.
Okay.
So the first question is in terms of just next word probability, next word and previous word probability. Does the correct choice aligns with what's likely to happen in natural language? Because you're looking in terms of grammaticality to connect it to the previous sentence, so to the declarative sentence. But I wonder in terms of which one of these is the most likely to actually appear in a lexicon, to be used in a lexicon? Does the model align with what people ask more frequently, like the type of questions that people generate more frequently? And to connect to this, the second part is when you had the cat question, you train on child-directed speech and on questions generated from child-directed speech, but you test on different kinds of questions. So are these questions taken from real questions asked by people or generated artificially based on declarative sentences?
Yeah, well, we had to generate them artificially because there are really no examples of the. I mean, that's kind of part of the point. I mean, we found, I think, one example of a question with a relative clause of the subject in the whole corpus.
So that's in child-directed speech.
Yeah.
But did you try to use questions not from child-directed? So to see if you train on child-directed speech, but then test on real-world languages from not
Yeah.
child-directed speech.
So we wanted questions that used the lexicon that was available in child-directed speech, but had the structure that is missing from child-directed speech. So we couldn't literally take a question from the internet and because the model wouldn't know what to do with it. But yeah. Sorry, what was the other thing that I wanted
The
to
other
say?
thing is just
Oh,
in
the-
terms of
Yeah.
probability.
Yeah, I mean, basically the other evaluation is more convincing in my view. I share your skepticism. That's why we did it. However,
Curiosity, not skepticism.
yeah. No, so there's something about this training setup that's very natural. You just predict the next word, and whereas here there's this like stage where you fine tune the model to form questions, which is not something that you think children have to do. But the trade-off is that the evaluation here has to be a little bit weird and convoluted because you can't ask the model to generate a question. It just doesn't know how to do it. So you have to implicitly infer what questions it likes from the probabilities that it assigns to strings of words. One thing that we didn't do, which might be interesting, is to see how people do on this task. Like maybe people will also find it difficult. I mean, the model doesn't see the declarative, right? The model only sees the 6 variants of the question. So I don't know how often people will choose variant E over the other ones. Which one did you say you like?
So I wonder if you just give the 6 options to people, if they would choose D, or something that ends with D try.
I like A too.
You like?
Yeah,
Well,
that
D-
ends with D try, right? I just think so. There are 2 probabilities, right? So there's forward probability and backward probability. And I think that and most models these days have both anyway. And I just wonder if the acceptable question is biased towards what's most likely in the language. So yeah, A or D seem to me. So it's just calculating probabilities without any model. Like
Well, A and D, just to be clear, A and D are actually not grammatical in English, but maybe they are tempting. I mean, maybe it's
They're
one of
very
those. Yeah.
Yeah, but they're not grammatical in terms of like a grammaticality test, but we're doing like descriptive grammar. Then, if all of us here has the dog who's seen a boy did try, then it is grammatical.
Well, but
Words. I'm here to defend the use-based part. If everybody uses language that way,
no, that's not what I meant. Sorry. You think people say this? Like who's seen?
The dog
has the dog who's seen a boy did try.
Well, I think maybe you have like a little
Yeah, you're
S
having, like,
apostrophe
an
here. But I mean, I think it's one of those.
Yeah, I'm thinking that I think that Libby and I are thinking about language use maybe of
Yeah.
and maybe if you get humans to do the test.
I think we should. I think that's missing from the paper. There's to.
And it would also then it adds another variable. There would be is English your L1 or your L2? Because probably I don't know, maybe it would have has the dog who's seen the boy did try pass to L2 learners of English, but not to L1.
I mean, it could be that there are different dialects of English, but I don't think that the corpus contained that many. Yeah, I don't know actually. I don't know enough about the children there, but I think yeah, maybe we can ask another question. Yeah.
Can I ask you about the first part of your experiment? You alluded to some work about island constraints.
Yeah.
So that's one of the areas that I work in too, but mainly on like the acceptability judgment side of it. And so I'm wondering if there are models, so I'm not computationally literate in that sense, but if there are models that can be trained to respect island constraints without some sort of grammar input. Like a lot of the debates in the like psycholinguistic world are what are the source of these island constraints, right? Is it like a memory limitation or is it a grammar thing? And so a lot of the studies I published are like, well, it must be grammar because we do a lot of these like memory tasks and we see that they don't relate. I'm interested like, what do these neural networks have to say for the actual like cognitive instantiation of these grammar, supposedly grammar things?
Well, I think that's a really good question. Well, but there are two good questions there. One is about what does it teach? I guess okay, I can unite the two questions. What does the fact that a neural network that's just trained to predict the next word without having anything, any kind of innate grammatical principles in it, the fact that it learns to respect island constraints, what does that teach us? That's the question. So it doesn't necessarily tell us that. Well, there are different explanations for island constraint. One that's about that has to be grammatically specified, another that it's about like pragmatics or something. There, I guess, it would be hard to distinguish that just based on the fact that the neural network learned them, because it's possible the neural network is learning something about pragmatics versus it's learning something about grammar. But also, just because I don't think that anyone disputes that at least some island constraints are grammatical. Like if you have the what's called the conjunct island constraints.
Right, like strong islands or like
yeah,
weaker.
yeah, it's like I ate a pizza and a burger, and you can't ask what did you eat a pizza and, right? I think everyone would argue that that's grammatical. I think that the debate would be does it need to be innate, or can you learn that grammatical rule from observing a lot of questions and noticing that no one ever asks a question about just one conjunct. I don't know if
That's a very interesting point. So the syntactic island is a kind of grammatical blocking. You cannot move something out of that island easily. Right? So the island is a syntactic unit. You call it CP. Okay. For example, I'm wondering the dog who has seen a boy did a try. This is input example, right? So that did. Now when you ask a yes no question, if there's an auxiliary, you have to insert it. So the question is where that auxiliary must be inserted. So now if you put the did within who has seen a boy, this is island. Right? So the auxiliary did is now inserted into the island. Then you force it to move. So that's what it may cause confusion, right? It's an experimental research, right? So I'm thinking about where the auxiliary must be inserted. Right.
Okay.
So if did is inserted outside that CP, that island, who has seen a boy, so there will be less confusion, less learning difficulty. Now, this is about syntax, not about model.
Yeah. I don't know what to say to that, but
I'm sorry, I'm asking a question.
yeah.
The trained model is capable of transforming declarative sentences into yes/no questions. Have you ever tried the WH questions?
What would you suggest we look at?
Yeah, when you try WH questions from declarative sentences to WH questions, you will see the issue of I.
Right.
That's why WH movement turns out to be more difficult than yes/no question.
Well, so in the work that I mentioned that looked at implicit learning of island constraints, they didn't teach the model to form questions, but they actually that work and our work also, we didn't look at only at questions but also at movement out of relative clauses in declarative sentences. So there you don't even need to have questions and you still have islands. So I guess this work found that you can, in many contexts, the model is able to respect those constraints, meaning assign a higher probability to a sentence where don't move out of an island. So I don't know what that teaches us in your view. Like what are you anyway, yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe we should discuss more.
If I teach you syntax, I do teach syntax.
Yeah.
So it's the structural trees.
Yeah.
We reveal in which syntactic node that auxiliary should be inserted into.
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss
Then you
this.
have
Like,
subject-verb inversion,
maybe
subject-auxiliary inversion.
maybe I can send you a link to that paper later, and we can talk about it over email or something.
No, your models are amazing models.
Thank
They
you.
handle
Thank
the
you.
things that humans cannot.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a good question in the back. I don't know. Should we end or like when?
And you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so for these variants, I don't know, to me, like, did the dog who has seen a boy try, it seems like it shifts from an active auxiliary into like a passive voice, has seen.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if that, because has the boy who has seen a boy try, to me, it seems like it fully stays within the passive voice. Though the correct variant, like, I agree, it seems correct to me. I'm just wondering, perhaps the model prefers did the dog who saw a boy try.
Yeah.
This might not.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think yes. So you're saying that maybe you can. Which is the one that it prefers? Yeah, it prefers this one, which is like really not. But I think what you're saying that maybe it's like a reader can think that oh, there's a mistake here, instead of I'm seeing seen, but actually the speaker intended to say saw or something, and they're kind of correcting the error in their minds. Yeah, it's possible. And that's why we should run the human experiment. So should is this time?
There are classes at 5:30.
Yeah. All right.
That was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I didn't mean to run.